Hello and welcome back to the third session with Paul Howard's Fluting Jig. Today I'm going to attempt to do some faceplate work. In fact, using this piece of 9.5 inch by 1.25 inch Sycamore, I'm going to attempt to replicate a decorated platter that Paul actually has on his website. Now, as you will see, this example piece that Paul has here on his website has some decoration in the form of grooves in an arc going round the rim of the platter. So, in order to try to replicate Paul's example, we will need to mount the router onto his hinge base, which is an optional extra. This will allow the router to be moved in a way which describes arcs on faceplate work. So here then, I'm dismounting the router from the base plate and remounting it onto the hinge base. Okay, as you can see, I've now mounted the router on the hinge base, which allows the cutting head to move in an arc or an annular orientation. To stop the router from falling over for the time being, I'm just going to put a couple of bits of wood, some oak and some oak-angle offcuts under the rotor, just to stop it falling over. So here I'm just getting the blank trued up and the face cleaned up. Just marking out here where the jaws are going to fit. And here just roughing out the base of the platter. Just checking the base is slightly concave and then moving on to the recess. Abrading the rear of the platter down to 240. A liberal dosing with pre-thinned sanding sealer. Give that a few minutes to dry off, then denibbed with all the zeros of wire wool, followed by a blowing out of the dust with the airline, and then a coat of undiluted sanding sealer. Time for some Yorkshire grit. Keep working at it until it's done its work. And you can tell, of course, when your paper towel comes away clean. Being a little bit more optimistic about the outcome of today's work, I'm preparing a recess to insert my logo should the piece be okay. So moving on, time to dismount the platter from the faceplate, remount the index plate and mount the piece back in the jaws. So here, just truing up the face of the platter. Just marking up here the boundaries of the recess in the bowl. Here, just roughing out the shape of the platter, and I'm going to attempt to put a slight curve on the rim. Having more or less achieved the shape that I desired, I'm sanding here down through the grits right down to 600. Right, I decided to add some spirit stain to give a good background. I wanted to use spirit stain so that the grain of the wood showed through, and also of course so you can easily see where the router is working. I've put on several coats here of spirit stain, and then when it's dry denibbed it with all the zeros wire wool. When I've removed all the dust, I gave it a very light coating with acrylic sanding sealer. One of the reasons was that I imagined that having a fairly hard surface would help prevent any tear out on the surface from the router blade. Okay, so before we go any further, we need to think about what type and size of cutter we're going to use in the router, and how many iterations there needs to be. So I've done a bit of basic mathematics. The radius of the inner circle is 50 millimeters, which gives a circumference of about 314 millimeters. Now that 314 millimeters divided by 8 millimeters, which is the size of the cutter I've decided to use, well, that gives us about 40 iterations, but we only want to use every other one of those, so we're down to 20, which is every fourth hole on the index plate. I spent a little bit of time yesterday afternoon and this morning looking at guide bushes and the possible shapes, and have designed a few and turned a couple on the lathe from a piece of old Ovengol. So now then we need to fit a guide bush and the cutter to the router. So I'm going to be using this 8mm core box cutter and a guide bush, which is a bullnose, which should follow the contour of the platter, which is slightly curved towards the lip. Okay, that's the router cutter in place and the bush guide in place, set for a depth of approximately 4 millimeters. Okay, so moving on and thinking about the shape of the cut I want to achieve, and it's fairly obvious that the lower the router in the jig, the tighter the arc will be. So I'm going to set it quite low to get an interesting pattern on the rim. Now, since the guide bush here is governing the depth of cut, we don't have to worry about cutting too deep or restricting the router in a forward motion. Keeping the router low, it's definitely going to give us a nice tight circle or a tight arc across the face of the platter. I do feel as though we need to control the movement of the router in a horizontal way across the lathe bed, so I'm going to screw 2 battens either side of the hinge attachment to ensure it doesn't wander off. Okay, I've screwed down the 2 battens then, and we've got good control over horizontal movement. Okay, doing all my safety checks now, making sure there's no obstructions for the router. Index plate secure, the chuck is secure, the lathe is switched off and unplugged. I think we're good to go. It's a little bit wider than I thought it would be, but okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, I've used a red whiteboard Sharpie to mark out the positions on the index plate. Dust in my face. I'm going to stop and put on my 3M mask. But so far so good, no mishaps. Okay then, so an examination of the piece post routing reveals not too many errors. There's a little bit of tear out along the edges in some areas, but I think that can be sanded out. There's a little bit of bleeding from the dye into the wood in some areas. I'm hoping that can be sanded out too. I'm using this piece of rolled up 240 grain abrasive to clear out the flutes to get rid of the undesirables that I mentioned earlier. This process actually took me about 20 minutes. And to get the finish that I wanted in the flutes, I went from 120 to 180 to 240 grains. Okay, now I've cleaned up the fluting satisfactorily. I just need now to turn out this bowl in the centre. Okay, so just now need to clean up the centre bowl. I'm going to sand it to 400 grain, put some sanding sealer on it, denib that, and then apply some acrylic lacquer. I wasn't expecting to finish this piece, but I think it's a keeper. So I'm just going to finish it off now by gluing my logo into the recess in the base with some PVA glue. Okay then, so I decided rather than just leave this as a test piece to finish it off. Quite satisfied with the outcome, although if you look carefully you'll see that some of the flutes, particularly here, are not the same size because I didn't follow round with the round nose guide bush correctly, so I got some slightly inconsistent depths and widths of the fluting on the entry and exit. However, for a first effort, I'm more than happy with this. So what did I learn? Yeah, it's quite easy to do faceplate work with this. I chose a spirit stain to colour the wood, which was probably not a good idea because it bleeds into the wood itself, and as you may have noticed when I was abrading the flutes, there was some heavy staining there which had to be removed. It actually took me about 30 minutes in real time to abrade this piece. So I think I'll probably use acrylic paint next time I do one, over the top of acrylic sanding sealer, which means that there shouldn't be any bleeding of the colour into the wood. In fact, I chose to use a spirit stain and not anything else on this particular piece because I wanted to, well, I didn't want to lose the grain of the wood. If you use acrylic paint or anything else, then obviously you're going to lose it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I did turning this piece.